my wonderful friends. This is Ricardo. Um, Irrational exuberance. I've said before, language is a little like reality. It comes down to what we personally make of it, and it's amazing that we understand what each other says most of the time or writes most of the time, because language has its limitations, just like all our human perceptions of what's real. So when I say irrational exuberance, I'm reminded of Alan Greenspan, which, by the way, I couldn't quite place it in history, and of course I asked ChatGPT. So thanks to ChatGPT, I'm reminded that Greenspan said that the stock market had irrational exuberance. Remember that? That was December 1996. It was 3 years before the Dow started to take a nosedive, and NASDAQ conspicuously took a nosedive. NASDAQ between March of 2000, and I was surprised it took this long, March of 2000, October 2002, so peak to valley, a 78% drop of the NASDAQ. But it took 2 years, and the Dow similarly lost 38%, not as bad. But the NASDAQ really hit it. This is the dot-com. Remember when we talk about the AI concern, that the dot-com bubble was 3/4 of the value of the market. Of course, it all recovered. So people who did nothing, very Zen-like, people who did nothing, unless their business went out of business, which a whole bunch did okay, have done so far. But when I say rational, anything can be rational. When someone says, "Oh, it's irrational," well, even these guys that do, I've mentioned before, you take some mass murderer, they had a reason. It was, so and so offended me, so there's always a reason for actions. It's just, compared to what? What's the outcome? So what I want to say is irrational is to put a little spin on what I've said is the cliche, it's always darkest before dawn. And this is a pretty healthy psychological self-help type of truism, which is when you think you're just absolutely at the end of your rope, that's when the enlightenment happens. And in AA, for example, the classic story is someone that winds up in the ditch and has lost all their family and their money and their everything is just completely awful. That's the turning point when you really feel the pain. So Trump and Trumpism and make America great again. The intentions, of course, were good, and the intentions are supposedly patriotic. But I think until we really feel the pain of just how comprehensive a model Trump and Trumpism is, of all the old cliches about power and control and politics that we've been hearing for years, and that presumably, in some interpretations of American history, America stood as a departure from the old world, from monarchies, from the pre-Enlightenment notion of divine power and control. Divinely, and those humans who would align themselves with God and invoke God's majesty in a personified version. And so, we have the Enlightenment philosophers and science that said, well, no, the idea of someone that's dressed up like us, that looks like us, a blue-eyed white guy in robes, it's a fantasy. It's art as a lie that makes us see truth that presumably inspires us to moral advances, and the golden rule. These are all corny cliches, but they work in a lot of ways. And we have a hostility towards organized religion because, again, it gets corrupted with human ambition and human materiality. And, I've been another, well-known in something that I've studied, the monastic corporations of the Middle East, of the Middle Ages, all were quite profitable and big engines of commerce. These vineyards and farms and cheese making and whatever else that these very effective collaborative communes generated advanced human civilization in a lot of ways. So here's Trump, who is the fulfillment of a lot of these classic notions of you must power, the Peter the Terrible, and Vlan the Ivan the Impaler. What's the other? All these horrible, deadly conquerors of the past who we associate with human progress and success, and it's quite the opposite. Even though you can say, well, gee, the aftermath of wars seem to have generated some progress, and here we have the post-World War II and the era that I grew up with Eisenhower. And when you look at Eisenhower, he's got, for me, a model of the way, the real talking about making America great again. Now, obviously, we had troubles. This is just pre-civil rights legislation, which kind of was fulfilled in the early 1960s. So presumably, we had, the resolution to the complete betrayal of the 15th Amendment, and black people were allowed to register to vote in the South. And of course, we were so hypocritical at the time. We were criticizing Russia with being godless and heartless, and of course we were the greatest hypocrites of all. So presumably we learned our lessons, and no, we haven't, because we cling to this idea of the ferocious power of command. And we got a guy that's shrewd enough to realize that the hole in the Constitution was the same as the hole in the Roman Republic in ancient Rome, which is when you have a national military emergency, national security is the trump card that's played in socially advanced democracies. Happened to Italy, happened to Germany, happens to us in the version of Trump, who's trying again this impulse to the unity of command, which I attribute to the same problem that we have with language and perception of reality, which is we're all encased in we're packaged as individual egos, and we make up the world ultimately ourselves. And it depends on how we've experienced the world personally. And the sequence, we can have acquired the same knowledge in school, but when we learn the lessons, how aware we were at the time we were learning the lesson, who taught us the lesson, what happened right after we learned the lesson, that all stacks up differently, uniquely, and times 6 billion. And we're never going to be on the same page. We're never all going to have the same notion of reality. But when we think of ourselves as a group body, as a body politic, we inevitably have one person that's the leader. So we envision our minds can only grasp in terms of individuality, individual personalities. And sure enough, this is the instinct early on, thousands of years ago. Shepherds looking up at the stars personified the stars. So here's Mars as a person, and here's the sun, which, is a guy in his chariot that was going across the sun. And we, in order to store stuff as a memory, we have to personify it, we have to theatricalize it, we have to think in terms of play, all the worlds of play. So let me pursue a couple of points about Eisenhower, which was, if you look at, and I did a post on this, if you look at Eisenhower, his when he was leaving office, and also the the Republican convention in 1956 when he's going for re-election. He's saying, look, we can't have a world where we expect that we're going to be an island of prosperity and the rest of the world starves to death. We got to help the rest of the world. This is where foreign aid and the Marshall Plan really got implemented, which is we're giving money to our former enemies. We're giving them, we're not just loaning them and then calling back the loans and crushing their economies. We're giving them money, and sure enough, and that actually established the dollar from which we benefited, up until, 70s, 80s. I don't want to get into the weeds here in terms of some of the politics, but back in the 90s, we had a what's called a marginal tax rate, which means the very richest people kicked in 90%. 90% of their income, which is where we get the Beatles song in terms of tax man. It's one for you, one for me, 19 for you, and that's the ratio. Is 19% of incomes went to the state and 5% went to the individual. Now that got a little heavy, but for a good few decades, I think that was marginal tax rate was way up there. So it got way reduced, and sure enough, we have this imbalance in terms of distribution of wealth. But back in the 50s, we had these returning veterans that you'd go to college and get loans, and you could buy a house with maybe, I think the ratio was 3 times your yearly income, which it's not exactly easy call these days. So we all know these problems, but I'm saying that until it gets really, really bad, we aren't inclined to face what has happened to inform ourselves as to history. And now, a lot of us has gone to school. So this is why I talk about, let me begin with the irrational exuberance and why I think reasons to be cheerful, even in spite of, and actually because of Trump. Here we have Trump, who is an example of, let's test all these old notions of this power, the real politic, which is power commands and power. And let's see, a lot of recent socialist-based, Marxist-based criticism is, how terrible business is, and it's awful, and everything's terrible, and it's all about power and so forth. A lot of it doesn't feel like power, it doesn't intend like power. I grew up and, I found American business is pretty good. We're an ethnic family, and, it's a classic story. Ethnic family comes to the United States, creates a business, and prospers. And sure enough, a lot of us were lucky enough to have college, and schooling helps. But when you go to school, you learn, some critical approach, critical analysis of what's going on. You can't hide some of the mistakes that America's made. And in fact, if you look at the scientific method, that's the way to go. Correct your faults. Understand what reality. Try your very best to understand reality, what's really happening. See things as they really are, and then correct it if you can. So now we have the opportunity to test all these other counter arguments, which is no, this is an imposition of power, and the might and the power, and here we've got Trump. We have an opportunity to I was thinking of the idea of my brother and sister-in-law had this, where they did the marriage vows again, which to reaffirm some of the basic principles. I think we have an opportunity now, but only after the demonstrable failure of a rulership like Donald Trump. This is why dictatorships fail, and we're going to see the failure. We have yet to see it. I don't think this is the problem. I don't know if we've suffered yet. But if and when the crash comes, and I think it's already apparent that the guy is, a bluff like so many dictators. It's the guy behind the curtain that we saw in the movies, Wizard of Oz, that we're going to see manifestly how wrong it is to go in this particular direction. We're going to have to reaffirm, going to have to take a closer look at our Constitution. 15th Amendment is the one that keep coming up. You know, you can have written words unless you have the heart to do it, unless you're willing to do it. It doesn't mean anything, which means this is my argument for a civic religion. Religion's got a bad reputation, but if you look in the history, and I've taught to this, Jonathan Edwards, the second Great Awakening, there was something in American history called the Great Awakening, which prefigured the Union of States, which prefigured the creation of the Constitution. It was before that. The idea that these preachers would go from one state to another actually enhanced and evoked this sense of unity among the states, that we have something in common, that we have, and at the time it was a Christian notion. But this is echoed in other disciplines. You don't have to look far. You can find this in Hindu and Islam and so forth, which is to get the human ego out of the way and think of something transcendent, which is each other. And if you look closely, and I'm just discovering this stuff, I'm not turning up anything original here, but the quantum physicists are making all these connections with the Far Eastern religions and Taoism and so forth. And this idea of a unity of humanity, of one world, of a green kind of, we are all connected and we all, whatever hostility we're putting out there is really, coming back. What goes around comes around, another cliche, but there's truth to it, that there is some unity, that science and religion does not have to be at odds. Some of the expression of religion has to come down to earth a little bit, and we have to get our egos a little bit out of the way and not think that we're the center of the universe, that God is a personality that's just selected us for transcendence. No, we're just we just happen to have the dumb luck to be the planet in the right proximity to the sun to have life, and we may be the only act around. There may not be other life in the rest of maybe that's all we got is each other, and this may help. Here's some reasons to just let me conclude. Everything looks terrible, but look. Here's what's unique about us happening right now that's never happened before in history, generally speaking. My favorite, broadcasting and films that happened just since Mussolini. I mark it because my mother keeps talking about Mussolini on the radio, and sure enough, fascism had this idea that we can all talk to each other simultaneously. We make some mistakes with it. It's like a kid with a hot rod car that's just learning how to drive. We made mistakes, but there's good things to it too. There's also FDR did radio. We had radio in which we began the whole notion of situation comedies and family-based theater, and there's some 50-50. Half of it can be really good. Half of it can be really enlightening. Half of it, education, is really good. We all know history. We all know the mistakes of the past, and it's more common than it used to be. Not universal. People are still making weird interpretations because that's what they're going to do. And thank God we have, the capacity to have different interpretations, because that's our imagination and that's where our innovations come from. Film and broadcasting, I think, is a good thing. It doesn't have to be all mind-bending propaganda. It can be educative. It can be enlightening. The kids that I see in high school, it's another thing. And it's maybe only America, it's only where it's wealthy. Maybe this isn't happening in the rest of the world. But I'm pretty old. I don't remember kids. I've got 8th graders that are like 6 feet tall. It's like a super race. When you go to schools these days, the kids are gigantic. That's just now. Something's going right. Nutrition, you could ruin your life. Yeah, absolutely. Additives, all this is, but science, good. FDA, good. Medicine, real good. I grew up, polio was a big deal. Vaccines, good. we can make this point again and again, and here again, we have the opportunity post-Trump to say, hey, look, you made a big mistake, and here's the wreckage. But we got to see the wreckage before it's convincing. So I think we just need to get, and again, it's this thing about interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution is great, but you got to do it in good faith. And that's why I make a big fuss about the expression good faith. You can have bad faith, which means, oh, yeah, all you need to do is see Trump for bad faith. Oh, yes, the market's great. Everything's terrific. We're winning. Mission accomplished. Okay. Yeah, all right. Bad faith, good faith. But faith, we got to have it just not, you can't just split hairs and go into litigation for every little thing. We're not going to get anywhere. We got to have the spirit of goodwill. And that is a faith-based thing. That's something that's just we can't, it can't be expressed adequately in language. We got to go on to the, what Miguel Cruz would call right hemisphere matters. Stuff that goes beyond words. Stuff that gets a little vibey and spooky and trippy and so forth. But there's something to it. And that's what I think we got to cultivate. So that's my thing right now. Well, let me know what you think, please. Tell me I'm wrong.